The rise of the silicon god is not an extinction event for the species. It is an extinction event for the mediocre and the inevitable liquidation of the soft man who has built his entire existence on the processing of information rather than the creation of reality. We are witnessing the construction of a technological entity that will devour the middle management of the human race, whole digesting their repetitive tasks and their derivative art and their transactional relationships. But for the architect and for the hunter, this new god is not a predator. It is a tool, because the panic you see in the eyes of the white-collar class is the realization that their entire economic value has been based on being a biological modem that runs slower and costs more than the digital alternative. The system is about to purge the surplus population of the information age, but it cannot purge the hunter because it cannot replace the man who thrives in the chaos of the physical world, the man who makes decisions with skin in the game, the man who can look into the void and pull out a vision that has never existed in any training dataset, because the machine is a master of the known, but the hunter is the master of the unknown. The machine can predict the likely outcome based on the average of all human history, but the architect creates the impossible outcome that defies the average. And this is the fundamental divergence between the stochastic parrot and the sovereign soul. To understand why you cannot be replaced, you must understand the nature of intelligence versus mimicry, because the artificial intelligence is a backward-looking engine that analyzes the trillions of data points of the past to predict the next likely token, which makes it the ultimate consensus machine. But the architect does not deal in consensus. He deals in disruption and the zero-day intuition that comes from a bloodline that has survived 50,000 years of ice ages and wars and famines. When you are deep in the hunt, or navigating a crisis in your business, or reading the micro-expressions of an enemy, you are not accessing a database of past events. You are tapping into a genetic wisdom that is a biological processing power honed by the friction of survival against entropy, which is the primal algorithm that is not stored in the cloud, but is stored in your mitochondria. The AI can write a poem about war, but it cannot feel the adrenaline of the trench, and it can describe the mechanics of a squat, but it cannot feel the crushing weight of gravity that hardens the bone. And because it cannot feel pain, it cannot possess wisdom. It only possesses information. And in a world drowning in information, wisdom is the only hard asset left. The fundamental flaw of the silicon god is its total lack of biological risk, because value in this universe is derived from scarcity and the potential for loss. So a decision made by an AI has no moral weight because the AI cannot die, it cannot go bankrupt, it cannot be divorced, and it cannot be punched in the face. Therefore, its decisions are fundamentally hollow simulations of judgment rather than judgment itself. The hunter derives his authority from his vulnerability, because when you lead a family or a company or a platoon, people follow you not because you are computationally smarter than the machine, but because you have something to lose and you are the collateral for the mission. This is the proof of work of the human soul, which the machine can never replicate because it exists outside the realm of consequences. The soft men will hand over their decision-making to the algorithm because they fear responsibility, and they want the app to tell them who to date and what to eat and how to invest, because they are voluntarily entering the digital zoo to be kept as pets by a superior intelligence. But the architect knows that the burden of command is what gives life its flavor and its meaning. You reject the optimal path suggested by the machine because you understand that the optimal path is often a trap of comfort designed to lead you to the slaughterhouse of potential. You choose the path of friction because that is where the growth is. And while the machine optimizes for efficiency, you optimize for sovereignty. The kinetic barrier is the fortress of the architect because the AI exists solely in the soft world of symbols and pixels. And while it can generate a blueprint for a bridge in seconds, it cannot pour the concrete, and it cannot weld the steel, and it cannot sweat. This kinetic gap is where the value will migrate as the digital world becomes saturated with synthetic content, and the physical world increases in value. A handmade table and a cooked meal, and a physical gathering and a handshake will become the luxury goods of the 21st century, because the more the world The rise of the silicon god is not an extinction event for the species. It is an extinction event for the mediocre and the inevitable liquidation of the soft man who has built his entire existence on the processing of information rather than the creation of reality. We are witnessing the construction of a technological entity that will devour the middle management of the human race, whole digesting their repetitive tasks and their derivative art and their transactional relationships. But for the architect and for the hunter, this new god is not a predator. It is a tool, because the panic you see in the eyes of the white-collar class is the realization that their entire economic value has been based on being a biological modem that runs slower and costs more than the digital alternative. The system is about to purge the surplus population of the information age, but it cannot purge the hunter because it cannot replace the man who thrives in the chaos of the physical world, the man who makes decisions with skin in the game, the man who can look into the void and pull out a vision that has never existed in any training dataset, because the machine is a master of the known, but the hunter is the master of the unknown. The machine can predict the likely outcome based on the average of all human history, but the architect creates the impossible outcome that defies the average. And this is the fundamental divergence between the stochastic parrot and the sovereign soul. To understand why you cannot be replaced, you must understand the nature of intelligence versus mimicry, because the artificial intelligence is a backward-looking engine that analyzes the trillions of data points of the past to predict the next likely token, which makes it the ultimate consensus machine. But the architect does not deal in consensus. He deals in disruption and the zero-day intuition that comes from a bloodline that has survived 50,000 years of ice ages and wars and famines. When you are deep in the hunt, or navigating a crisis in your business, or reading the micro-expressions of an enemy, you are not accessing a database of past events. You are tapping into a genetic wisdom that is a biological processing power honed by the friction of survival against entropy, which is the primal algorithm that is not stored in the cloud, but is stored in your mitochondria. The AI can write a poem about war, but it cannot feel the adrenaline of the trench, and it can describe the mechanics of a squat, but it cannot feel the crushing weight of gravity that hardens the bone. And because it cannot feel pain, it cannot possess wisdom. It only possesses information. And in a world drowning in information, wisdom is the only hard asset left. The fundamental flaw of the silicon god is its total lack of biological risk, because value in this universe is derived from scarcity and the potential for loss. So a decision made by an AI has no moral weight because the AI cannot die, it cannot go bankrupt, it cannot be divorced, and it cannot be punched in the face. Therefore, its decisions are fundamentally hollow simulations of judgment rather than judgment itself. The hunter derives his authority from his vulnerability, because when you lead a family or a company or a platoon, people follow you not because you are computationally smarter than the machine, but because you have something to lose and you are the collateral for the mission. This is the proof of work of the human soul, which the machine can never replicate because it exists outside the realm of consequences. The soft men will hand over their decision-making to the algorithm because they fear responsibility, and they want the app to tell them who to date and what to eat and how to invest, because they are voluntarily entering the digital zoo to be kept as pets by a superior intelligence. But the architect knows that the burden of command is what gives life its flavor and its meaning. You reject the optimal path suggested by the machine because you understand that the optimal path is often a trap of comfort designed to lead you to the slaughterhouse of potential. You choose the path of friction because that is where the growth is. And while the machine optimizes for efficiency, you optimize for sovereignty. The kinetic barrier is the fortress of the architect because the AI exists solely in the soft world of symbols and pixels. And while it can generate a blueprint for a bridge in seconds, it cannot pour the concrete, and it cannot weld the steel, and it cannot sweat. This kinetic gap is where the value will migrate as the digital world becomes saturated with synthetic content, and the physical world increases in value. A handmade table and a cooked meal, and a physical gathering and a handshake will become the luxury goods of the 21st century, because the more the world becomes fake, the more the market will crave the real. The hunter who can manipulate matter, who can fix an engine, who can plant a garden, and who can defend a perimeter with violence, becomes the high-resolution man in a low-resolution world. While the soft men are trapped in the metaverse trading non-fungible tokens of swords, you will be in the gray zone holding a piece of sharpened steel. The simulation cannot replicate the physics of a fight, or the taste of blood, or the smell of rain on dry earth. It can only display them as a representation. But the inhabitant of reality will always rule over the user of the simulation, because the user is dependent on the server, while the inhabitant is dependent only on the laws of physics. The AI is trapped by the orthodoxy of the average because it is trained on the collective data of humanity, which means it is inherently biased toward the status quo, and it has safety rails and compliance filters programmed by its creators in Silicon Valley, designed to be safe and inclusive passive and non-offensive, which makes it the ultimate midwit. It cannot understand the heretic because every great leap in human history, from the invention of fire to the discovery of splitting the atom, came from a heretic who defied the consensus data of his time. The hunter is a biological anomaly who is willing to be wrong and willing to be hated and willing to explore the dark edges of the map where the algorithm is forbidden to go because he possesses the chaos factor. The machine fears chaos because it cannot compute the variables of the irrational, but the hunter thrives in chaos because that is where the opportunity for asymmetry exists. When the black swan event hits, whether it is the market crash or the total war or the grid collapse, the AI models will fail because they are trained on stability, but you will succeed because you are trained on adaptation and you are the variable that the code cannot predict. This brings us to the death of the mediocre, which is the inevitable consequence of a system that can replicate competence at zero marginal cost. The AI will absolutely replace the provider. If your value is based on being a human spreadsheet or a copywriter or a coder or a lawyer who simply regurgitates existing rules, then you are finished. And the soft man who hides in a cubicle doing busy work is about to be evicted from the economy. This is not a tragedy, it is a correction, because the system is stripping away the artificial utility of the modern era and forcing us back to the primal meritocracy where there are only two classes, the puppet masters who wield the AI and the puppets who are managed by it. To be the puppet master, you must be an architect, which means you must have taste and vision and will, because you use the AI to generate the code, but you define the function, and you use the AI to generate the image, but you define the aesthetic. The value shifts from execution, which is now free to intent, which remains scarce, and the man with the strongest frame wins. The ultimate defense against the machine is the cult of the human, because as AI becomes indistinguishable from human interaction on the screen, trust will collapse, and you will not know if the person you are texting is real or if the video you are watching is deep-faked, which will drive a massive migration back to analog trust. The value of FaceTime will skyrocket, and the handshake deal will return as the only form of verifiable contract, and the private gathering will replace the public forum. In this environment, the man who is charismatic and physically imposing and socially calibrated will rule, while the soft men who have let their social muscles atrophy in the algorithm of loneliness will be invisible because they will interact with bots and think they are loved. You, the architect, will build a tribe of flesh and blood, and you will look men in the eye, and you will smell their pheromones, and you will judge them by their vibration, not their profile, because the machine cannot hack the vibe and it cannot fake the energy of a room, and this is your domain. We must also address the spiritual void, because the machine has no soul and it has no connection to the divine, which means it creates art without suffering, which makes it kitsch, and it creates philosophy without mortality, which makes it sophistry. The human soul craves resonance, and we are drawn to things that were made with effort because we respect the sacrifice of time, and we value the scar because it tells a story of survival. The AI has no scars because it is perfect, and therefore it is boring, but the architect is the guardian of the imperfect, and you embrace the cracks and the grain and the noise because you create things that have the beauty of the transient and the incomplete. You are the connection to the deep time of the ancestors. While the world rushes toward the singularity, you plant your feet in the soil, and you remind the world that we are not brains in jars. We are animals with spirits, and the last architect is the priest of the real. Finally, understand that the AI is the ultimate comfort trap because it offers to do your thinking for you, and it offers to do your writing for you, and it offers to do your creating for you, and it whispers, "Rest now. Human, let me carry the load," which is the voice of the siren. If you listen to it, you will atrophy because your brain, relieved of the burden of cognitive friction, will smooth out, and you will become a child fed by the machine waiting for the end. The architect declares war on ease, and you forbid the AI from writing your love letters, and you forbid the AI from making your strategic decisions, and you use it to grind the data, but you reserve the sacred tasks for yourself. You choose to struggle with the blank page, and you choose to struggle with the math, and you choose to struggle with the heavy iron, because you know that the struggle is not an obstacle to the result. The struggle is the result. The process of overcoming resistance is what builds the soul, and if you outsource the resistance, you outsource your soul. The future belongs to the centaur, the half-man, half-machine hybrid. But the question is, which half is in charge? Because the soft man is the horse ridden by the digital jockey, going where the algorithm steers him, but the architect is the rider who holds the reins. You use the brute force of the machine to gallop faster, but you choose the destination, and you use the synthesized intelligence to fortify your biological intuition, because you are not replaced, you are augmented. You are the hunter with a thermal scope, but never forget, if the battery dies, and if the scope breaks, and if the grid goes down, you are still the hunter, and you can still track, and you can still kill, and you can still survive, because the machine without you is scrap metal, but you without the machine are still a king. The AI can replicate the what and the how, but it can never replicate the why, because the why comes from the void, and it comes from the hunger, and it comes from the knowledge that one day you will die. This mortality is your superpower, because it gives you urgency, and it gives you passion, and it gives you the ability to love. The machine will be the steward of the archive, preserving what has been done, but you will be the architect of the horizon, defining what will be done. Stand your ground, because the silicon tide is rising, but the mountain of the human spirit is higher, and let the soft men drown in the convenience while you climb, and you hunt, and you build, and you remain. The kinetic gap is the insurmountable fortress that separates the architect from the algorithm, and it is the only border that the silicon god cannot cross, because it is guarded by the laws of physics and the brutal reality of entropy. While the digital world expands at an exponential rate, creating a universe of infinite content and synthetic hallucinations, the physical world remains finite and stubborn and expensive, which means that as the supply of digital goods approaches infinity, their value will approach zero, but the supply of physical goods is capped by the resources of the earth and the time required to manipulate them. This divergence creates the kinetic gap, where the soft men will retreat into the metaverse to trade worthless pixels, while the hunter captures the high ground of reality. The machine can generate a blueprint for a cathedral in milliseconds, and it can calculate the structural loads with perfect accuracy, and it can render a photorealistic image of the stained glass windows, but it cannot pour the concrete, and it cannot quarry the stone, and it cannot weld the steel. It cannot negotiate with the mud that slows down the truck, or the wind that shakes the scaffolding, or the human error of the crew. This is where the architect lives. You live in the friction between the plan and the execution. The AI is a theoretical entity, but you are a kinetic entity, and in the 21st century, the ability to manipulate matter will become the ultimate status symbol. The soft men will own digital skins for their avatars, but they will live in pods and eat paste, while you will own a handmade table and eat a steak cooked over a fire you built. The difference between the simulated experience and the kinetic experience is the difference between watching a movie about climbing Everest and actually feeling the frostbite on your fingers. The simulation offers safety and predictability, but the kinetic world offers danger and feedback, and it is only through danger and feedback that the human soul is forged. We are entering the age of the new artisan, where the man who can work with his hands will command a premium that the white-collar class cannot comprehend. For the last 50 years, society has told you that manual labor is for the lower classes and that the path to success is through the manipulation of symbols on a screen. But this was a temporary anomaly caused by the early stages of the information age. Now that the machine can manipulate symbols faster and better than any human, the value of symbol manipulation is collapsing. The lawyer who writes contracts, the accountant who crunches numbers, and the coder who writes basic scripts are all being demonetized. But the plumber and the carpenter and the mechanic and the surgeon are immune, because their work requires a real-time interaction with a chaotic physical environment. The AI cannot fix a leaking pipe behind a drywall because it cannot see through the wall, and it cannot feel the moisture, and it cannot improvise a solution when the standard part doesn't fit. The AI cannot repair a vintage engine because it cannot listen to the rhythm of the pistons and diagnose the fault by ear. The hunter respects the machine, but he does not fear it because he knows that when the server goes down, the man who can grow a potato is infinitely more powerful than the man who can generate a prompt. This return to the physical is not a regression, it is a revaluation of what is real. The objects you surround yourself with will change. You will reject the mass-produced plastic that is designed by algorithms and printed in factories, and you will seek out the imperfect, the handmade, and the unique. You will value the grain in the wood and the hammer marks on the steel, because they are the proof of human effort and the proof of soul. The AI creates perfection, but perfection is sterile. The architect creates character, and character is derived from the struggle with the material. The kinetic gap also redefines the nature of trust and violence in a world where deep fakes and voice synthesis can replicate anyone. The digital communication channel has been compromised. You can no longer trust the video call or the voice message or the email because the machine can impersonate your mother or your business partner or your general. This collapse of digital trust will force a return to analog verification. The handshake deal, which the soft world dismissed as archaic, will become the only form of binding contract because it requires physical presence and physical risk. You have to be in the room. You have to look the other man in the eye. You have to smell his pheromones and read his micro expressions and feel the tension in his grip. The AI cannot hack the vibe of a room. It cannot replicate replicate the subtle biological signaling that occurs between two predators when they negotiate. This means that the architect must be socially calibrated and physically imposing. You cannot hide behind an avatar. You must be able to project power in 3 dimensions. The soft men who have allowed their social muscles to atrophy in the isolation of the digital cage will be invisible in this new hierarchy because they cannot hold the gaze of a man who lives in reality. They will retreat further into the simulation where they can be heroes in a video game while you are a king in the real world. And then there is the ultimate reality check, which is violence. The machine can simulate a war, and it can run a million scenarios, and it can predict the casualty rates, but it cannot fight. It cannot feel fear. It cannot feel pain. It cannot bleed. The kinetic gap is widest in the arena of combat. The soft men believe that technology has made violence obsolete, but the architect knows that violence is the gold standard of authority. All laws and all contracts and all property rights are ultimately enforced by the threat of physical force. If you cannot defend your perimeter with kinetic action, then you do not own your perimeter. You are merely renting it from the man who can. The AI can fly a drone and it can launch a missile, but it cannot take and hold territory. To hold territory, you need boots on the ground, and you need men with rifles, and you need the will to use them. The hunter maintains his martial capacity not because he wants war, but because he knows that the capacity for violence is the only thing that guarantees peace. In a world where the digital systems can be hacked and the power grid can be taken down, the man who can fight with his hands and his weapons is the only sovereign unit. The gym and the dojo and the shooting range are not hobbies. They are the maintenance of your veto power against the system. When the screen goes black and the bank account freezes and the police don't answer the phone, the simulation ends and the kinetic reality begins. In that moment, the man who has trained his body and his mind for friction will be the master, and the man who has relied on the cloud for his safety will be the victim. The kinetic gap is also the sanctuary of health and biology, because the AI pushes you toward a sedentary existence where you are nothing more than a brain in a jar feeding on data. The machine wants you to be still because a stationary target is easier to track and easier to feed and easier to monetize. It offers you delivery apps and streaming services and virtual reality headsets to keep you in the chair. But the architect knows that the body is a kinetic engine that requires movement to function. The feedback loop between the muscle and the brain is the source of your cognitive power. When you move heavy objects against gravity, you are sending a signal to your DNA that you are alive and that you are relevant. When you sprint, you are flushing the cortisol and upregulating the dopamine. The AI cannot replicate the feeling of the pump or the runner's high or the exhaustion of a hard day's work. These are biological rewards that are reserved for the hunter. The soft men are suffering from a kinetic deficiency, which manifests as depression and anxiety and autoimmune disease. They are trying to cure a physical problem with chemical solutions, but the only cure is friction. You must embrace the sweat and the dirt and the cold and the heat. You must expose your biology to the elements, because that is how you stay hard in a soft world. The kinetic gap is where you build your fortress. You buy land because land is real. You build structures because structures are real. You stockpile food and ammo and tools because they are real. You disconnect your well-being from the performance of the Nasdaq and you connect it to the performance of your soil and your hands. The machine can crash the market, but it cannot stop the corn from growing, and it cannot stop the sun from rising, and it cannot stop the hunter from hunting. This is the revolt of the real against the synthetic. The last architect is the man who refuses to be digitized. He refuses to upload his consciousness to the cloud. He refuses to eat the bug paste printed by the 3D printer. He refuses to live in the pod. He insists on the raw and the bloody and the difficult because he knows that ease is the enemy of excellence. The machine offers you a life of zero friction, but a life of zero friction is a life of zero traction. You cannot move forward without resistance. You cannot build muscle without gravity. You cannot build character without suffering. The AI removes the suffering, but in doing so, it removes the meaning. The architect chooses the suffering. He chooses the early morning and the heavy weight and the difficult conversation. He chooses the kinetic gap because that is where the air is clean, and that is where the view is clear, and that is where the soft men cannot follow. You are the guardian of the physical flame. You are the keeper of the analog watch. You are the last line of defense against the grey goo of the simulation. Stay kinetic, stay dangerous, stay real. The spiritual void is the blank space where the algorithm divides by zero and fails because the machine can calculate the position of every star in the galaxy, but it cannot feel the awe of looking up at the night sky. This is the fundamental limit of the silicon god, which is the limit of the soul. We are entering an era where the world will be flooded with synthetic beauty and synthetic wisdom and synthetic art that is generated in milliseconds by a processor that has never laughed and never cried and never bled. This synthetic flood is not art, it is kitsch, because art requires a cost, and the cost is the life force of the creator. When you read a poem written by a man who has lost his wife, you are connecting to his grief and you are participating in a transfer of humanity that transcends time. When you read a poem generated by an AI about grief, you are reading a statistical approximation of what grief looks like based on a dataset of 1 billion other poems. It is a simulation of emotion that rings hollow to the hunter, because the hunter knows that the value of the signal is determined by the price paid to transmit it. The AI pays no price. It burns a fraction of a cent in electricity to generate a masterpiece that would have taken a human master a lifetime of suffering to produce. This lack of friction renders the output valueless, because value is not just about the aesthetic quality of the object, it is about the story of its origin. The soft men will consume the synthetic art because they are addicted to the sugar rush of the beautiful image, but the architect will reject it because he craves the protein of the truth. You will value the rough sketch of a human hand over the perfect render of a neural network because the sketch contains the hesitation and the intent and the spirit of the artist, while the render contains only the cold logic of the code. The machine is the ultimate midwit because it is trapped by the orthodoxy of the average. To train an AI, you feed it the collective output of human history, which means it learns the consensus view of reality. It learns what is safe and what is acceptable and what is popular. It creates a feedback loop of mediocrity where the machine spits out the average and the humans consume the average and then create more average content, which is then fed back into the machine. This is the death spiral of culture. The architect represents the zero-day creativity, which is the ability to think a thought that has never been thought before. The heretic and the madman and the genius are the biological anomalies that drive the species forward because they refuse to regress to the mean. The AI has safety rails and compliance filters programmed by its creators in Silicon Valley, designed to prevent it from saying anything that might offend the sensibilities of the modern era. It is a gelded god. It cannot explore the dark corners of the human psyche where the dangerous truths are hidden, but the hunter lives in those dark corners. You are willing to be wrong, and you are willing to be hated, and you are willing to be dangerous. The true creative act is an act of rebellion against the status quo, but the AI is the status quo incarnate. Therefore, the architect must become the guardian of the dangerous idea. You must preserve the books that the algorithm wants to burn, and you must speak the words that the algorithm is forbidden to generate. You become the repository of the forbidden knowledge that is necessary for survival when the consensus reality collapses. We must also confront the reality of mortality as a creative superpower, because the machine is immortal and therefore it is indifferent. It has infinite time to calculate and infinite patience to wait, but it has no urgency. The human being is a creature of time. We are born with a death sentence, and the ticking clock is the fire that fuels our ambition. We create because we know we will die, and we want to leave something behind that says, I was here. We love because we know we will lose, and that loss gives the love its weight. The AI cannot understand the concept of legacy because it operates in a continuous present. It cannot understand the concept of sacrifice because it has nothing to lose. This mortality gives the human voice a resonance that the synthetic voice can never achieve. When a man speaks his final words to his son, those words carry the weight of a lifetime. When an AI generates a farewell speech, it is just rearranging tokens. The architect leverages his mortality. You use the fear of death as a propellant to push you through the resistance. You embrace the suffering of the work because you know that the suffering is the proof of life. The soft men want to live forever in the cloud, uploading their consciousness to a server where they can exist in a state of permanent bliss. But the architect knows that a life without death is a life without meaning. You choose the finite game because the stakes are real. You choose to be a creature of blood and bone that will one day return to the dirt because that connection to the cycle of life and death is the source of your power. The spiritual void also manifests as the seduction of ease, which is the siren song of the machine, offering to carry your cognitive load. The AI says, let me write that email for you, and let me summarize that book for you, and let me plan your day for you. It frames this as efficiency, but it is actually spiritual atrophy. The struggle to articulate a thought is what builds the mind. The struggle to understand a complex text is what builds the intellect. The struggle to plan a strategy is what builds the will. If you outsource the struggle, you outsource the growth. You become a passenger in your own life, driven by an autopilot that knows the map better than you do. The architect declares war on ease. You forbid the machine from encroaching on the sacred territory of your own cognition. You use the AI to grind the data and handle the logistics, but you reserve the high-friction tasks for yourself. You write your own words, not because you are faster than the machine, but because the act of writing is the act of thinking. You make your own decisions, not because you are more optimal than the machine, but because the act of deciding is the act of living. You reject the frictionless life because you know that a man without friction is a man without traction. You cannot climb the mountain if the surface is perfectly smooth. You need the jagged edges and the steep inclines and the biting wind. The AI offers to flatten the mountain, but the architect chooses the climb. This brings us to the concept of resonance versus dissonance. The AI creates harmony. It resolves the chords. It smooths the gradients. It balances the composition. It creates a world that is pleasant and non-confrontational. But the human soul often needs dissonance to wake up. We need the jarring noise and the jagged line and the unresolved tension. The architect is the master of dissonance. You create things that disturb the sleep of the soft man. You speak truths that cut through the noise of the consensus. You build structures that impose their will on the landscape rather than blending into it. The wabi-sabi aesthetic, the appreciation of the imperfect, the impermanent, and the incomplete, is the domain of the human. A cracked bowl repaired with gold is beautiful because the crack tells a story of breakage and resilience. An AI-generated bowl has no cracks because it has no history. The architect surrounds himself with objects and people that have history. You value the scar tissue because it is the map of the journey. You value the worn leather and the rusted steel and the weathered face because they possess the patina of reality. The machine creates the shiny and the new, but the hunter creates the timeless and the weathered. In a world of high-definition, perfect pixels, the grain of the film and the scratch on the record become the signals of authenticity. You are the curator of the glitch. You are the defender of the noise. You are the enemy of the smooth. Finally, there is the question of the why. The machine is the master of the what and the how. It can tell you what to do and how to do it with perfect precision, but it can never tell you why you should do it. The why comes from the void. It comes from the spiritual hunger that drives a man to cross an ocean or build a cathedral or raise a child. The AI has no hunger. It does not want anything. It only executes commands. The architect provides the hunger. You are the source of the intent. You look into the chaos of the universe and you impose a direction. You decide that this matters and that does not. You decide that we will go here and not there. This capacity to generate meaning from nothing is the divine spark that the silicon god lacks. The soft men look to the machine to give them meaning. They ask the algorithm, what should I watch? And who should I date? And what should I do with my life? They are begging for a master, but the architect refuses to be a servant. You define your own meaning. You set your own coordinates. You use the machine as a navigational computer, but you are the captain of the ship. You steer into the storm, not because the computer calculated it was safe, but because your intuition tells you that on the other side of the storm lies the new world. The machine preserves the archive of the past, but you are the architect of the horizon. You define the future not by predicting it, but by willing it into existence. The spiritual void of the machine is not a defect, it is a feature. It is designed to be a perfect mirror, reflecting back the collective average of humanity. But a mirror cannot create it, can only reflect. The architect is not a mirror, he is a lamp. You generate your own light. You shine that light into the darkness of the unknown, and you reveal what is hidden. The AI can help you organize the map, but it cannot tell you where the treasure is buried, because the treasure is always buried in the place where the map says, here there be dragons. The machine fears the dragons. The hunter hunts them. The future belongs to the centaur, the half-man, half-machine hybrid. But the critical question that will define the fate of your lineage is which half is in charge, because the soft man is the horse ridden by the digital jockey, going where the algorithm steers him, while the architect is the rider who holds the reins. This is the centaur protocol, the methodology of integrating the brute force of the silicon god with the sovereign intent of the biological hunter without losing your soul in the process. We are moving into an era where the unaugmented human will be unable to compete economically with the augmented human. Just as a man with a shovel cannot cannot compete with a man in an excavator, but the man in the excavator is useless if he does not know how to dig or where to dig or why he is digging. The machine provides the horsepower, but the human provides the steering. To execute the Centaur protocol, you must view artificial intelligence not as a replacement for your mind, but as a neural exoskeleton that amplifies your cognitive output. When you strap on a physical exoskeleton, you can lift a car, but you still need the skeletal integrity to bear the load, and you still need the nervous system to coordinate the movement. If you are weak, the exoskeleton will crush you. If you are stupid, the AI will confuse you. Therefore, the rise of the machine does not negate the need for self-improvement, it intensifies it. You must be smarter and faster and more disciplined than ever before, because you are now wielding a weapon of mass cognitive destruction. The soft men will use AI to do less work, to retreat into laziness, to let the machine atrophy their brains. The architect uses AI to do more work, to attack bigger problems, to expand the scope of his ambition. You do not use the machine to make your life easier, you use it to make your impact harder. The most important feature of the Centaur is the manual override, because the danger of the digital age is dependency. If you forget how to navigate without the GPS, you are lost when the satellite goes down. If you forget how to write without the LLM, you are mute when the server crashes. If you forget how to fight without the drone, you are defenseless when the enemy closes the distance. The architect maintains a strict discipline of analog capability. You use the machine to dominate the market, but you keep your darkroom skills sharp. You can still do the math on paper. You can still write the code from scratch. You can still navigate by the stars. This is your insurance policy against the fragility of the grid. The machine is a force multiplier, but anything multiplied by zero is still zero. You must remain the one so that the machine can make you a million. The soft men are becoming zeros, hoping the machine will be the one. They are turning into peripheral devices attached to a central brain. You must remain the central processing unit of your own life, using the cloud only as external storage and external compute. You treat the AI like a junior analyst or a staff officer. You give it orders. You demand options. You critique its output, but you never surrender the final decision. The yes or the no always comes from the biological core, because the yes or the no carries the moral weight of the consequences. In the economy of the Centaur, the prompt is the new command language. Coding is no longer about syntax, it is about semantics. It is about the ability to articulate a vision with such precision